Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the 7th installment of the Junior Scholar Seminar Series run by Academia SG. Just by way of introduction, Academia SG is a collective of Singaporean academics who we felt need to get together to, one of our missions is of course to push Singapore studies. I'm Ian Chong, I teach political science. And today we have Edgar Liao, who's a PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia, who will be speaking to us about the colonial and Cold War origins of youth in Singapore. Of course, we like often to think about Singapore as a young country, but our aging demographic aside, this idea of youthfulness has been with us for a while, right? So Edgar will help us put it in historical context. He also works, of course, apart from the history of childhood and youth, but also the Cold War, imperialism, and decolonization. As discussant, we have my very good friend, my old friend from graduate school, actually, Sri Lanjan, who teaches at the Department of Chinese Studies at the National University of Singapore, who has done a lot on on urban cultural history of China, but also of youth and children's literature in Southeast Asia, particularly Singapore. So since we only have an hour, I'll not take up more time. I'll turn things over to Edgar, and I look forward to everyone's discussion later on.
All right, thanks so much, Ian. I'll now try to share my screen so that I can get going because those of you who are my friends will know that I'm very long-winded. So let me share my screen. Okay. Yeah. All right. Thanks everyone for sharing your Friday evening if you are in Vancouver, or Saturday morning if you're in Singapore with me here. And then if you are my friend or family who is just seeing whether I'm still fat, you've seen it. Now you can leave. Right, but here in UBC, it is our practice to start our presentations and meetings with land and territorial acknowledgement. So let me first begin by acknowledging that I'm zooming in from UBC Vancouver, which is on the traditional, ancestral, and the unceded territory of the Musqueam First Nations people. So I've pasted 2 links in the chat for anyone who is interested in finding out more about why we in UBC do this land acknowledgements, and all about the Musqueam people whose land on which we in UBC live, study, and work in. Right. So since this is my first public talk since I defended the dissertation, please allow me to thank the organizations that have funded my research and made my time in UBC possible. The University of British Columbia, of course, the Canada Vanier Graduate Scholarships, St. John's College UBC, and the Tankaki Foundation in Singapore. I would also like to thank my supervisors, Dr. John Rusa, Dr. Tamara Myers, and Dr. Leslie Paris from the UBC Department of History, and Dr. Mona Gleason from UBC Educational Studies for putting up with me and helping me make my dissertation possible. Right. And of course, I'd like to thank the Academic SG editors, and of course, Corey Tan for organizing this wonderful series and platform for junior scholars like me to present and workshop their work, and for my family and friends to see me, right? This is especially valuable for someone like me who is far away from home. And of course, thanks to the UBC Department of History and the UBC Center for Southeast Asian Research for co-organizing this talk. And last but not least, of course, thanks to Professor Sri Lanjan from NUS Chinese Studies for agreeing to be discussant. I love the book that she and the students put together so much that I brought it back with me in Vancouver. So this is the book that she and the students co-edited, 建构南洋儿童, right? So I'm sure you can buy it in Bras Brasa, right? Which is the complex of bookshops in Singapore for my friends in Vancouver. So I look forward to comments, suggestions, and criticism for my work. Even though I've defended it, I know that it is an incomplete and very flawed work. So I look forward to everyone's suggestions and criticism. I put my email on the slide in case you're looking to talk to me. Right. So I will start the presentation. Hopefully, I don't end too much over time. Right, and I'll begin with this little story that, as many of us know, Singapore likes to congratulate itself for being the first in many things. For example, a lot of us remember that when we were the host of the first summer edition of the Youth Olympic Games in 2010. In 1954, there was actually another international youth gathering in Singapore, which represented another first, the very first time the World Assembly of Youth met in Asia. But this, of course, this event we do not remember today. So in August 1954, 350 delegates representing 57 countries gathered in Singapore for the second General Assembly of the World Assembly of Youth. This was an international youth organization founded in 1949 by Western states and their colonies, including Singapore. And the way, according to British scholar Chris Sutton, was Britain's first covert front organization in its Cold War youth race. This global competition for the hearts and minds of young people between the Soviet Union and the democratic countries. Right. So the very first Way General Assembly was held in New York, so that the youth leaders from around the world can understand the American way of life and understand American democracy. And the very next General Assembly, and the very first one to be held in Asia, was then held in Singapore. And an organization in Singapore called the Singapore Youth Council organized this international youth meeting with the colonial government's strong support. And Singapore was chosen because Way members considered youth work in Singapore to be very advanced. And Singapore's selection also shows that it was seen as a significant location in the global struggle for the hearts and minds of young people. So of course, this raises a question, why had youth work become so advanced in Singapore by the 1950s when this domain was mostly neglected before the Second World War? Right, what was the Singapore Youth Council and how was it connected to the politics of youth, decolonization and the Cold War then? So my current dissertation tries to answer these questions by tracing the origins of what I call a political rationality of youth in modern Singapore. And by political rationality, I mean a particular way of thinking about young people in Singapore, which has impact on different domains of society, culture, and politics, and ultimately on how young people grow up in Singapore. So a lot of my dissertation will actually look at how, in a sense, some of the institutions and programs and policies that are meant to materialize this political rationality. And basically all of us who have grown up in Singapore after 1965 would have encountered some of these institutions in different ways. Just to show you an example of this political rationality that I'm curious about, let me show you the existence of this rationality in something that we use in our everyday life in Singapore. Right? If you read, all my friends in Singapore who are Singaporeans in the audience will know what these are. These are basically our money. And does it not strike you as a little strange or a little odd that we put so many images of children and youth on our currency notes? You look at other countries, what do they put? They put buildings, they put famous people. We put images of children and youth. And it isn't just that. Does it strike you as interesting that we represent, there's a particular pattern or particular way that we represent and portray ideal Singaporean children and youth? They are doing certain things, right? There are certain activities that they are doing, activities that we as young Singaporeans take for granted as everyday youth activities and youth culture in Singapore today. So what I try to do is actually to try to show that these ideas of what are normal everyday Singaporean youth and what normal everyday Singaporean youth cultures are actually part of they are historical, in a sense that they emerge out of a particular moment in time. This political rationality was institutionalized and normalized out of a particular historical moment, which I trace to the 1940s and the 1970s, and this was driven by a convergence of local and global factors and forces. So what I do in my dissertation is that, borrowing one of my supervisors, Dr. Tamara Myers' term, I argue that there was a youth turn in Singapore history between the 1940s and the 1970s. During this period, a diverse group of people in Singapore, Japan, Britain, the US, and elsewhere came to equate the children and youth of Singapore with the present and the future of the island city. But they became increasingly conscious of the need to discipline, to mobilize, and to police the activity and conduct and the subjectivity of young people. And I argue that this emerging cultural politics of youth led to the establishment of a youth-conscious and youth-centered Singapore disciplinary state. A state, I would define it as an extensive apparatus of disciplinary institutions, programs, and agents, both government and non-governmental, that tried to shape, regularize, homogenize, and regulate young people's subjectivities and conduct. And this was done ultimately to try to incorporate a diverse and divided population into productive and supportive relationships with the state and the economy. So in the presentation, I will try to talk about two organizations that I studied that were created during this period to demonstrate some of these points. And ultimately, historiographically speaking, I'm hoping that age relations, you will agree with me that age relations is a useful and important angle to study less understood aspects of the history of colonialism, the Cold War, and decolonization in Singapore. Right? And then compared to other categories of historical analysis like class, gender, and race, we have, in a sense, tended to undervalue or underlook the importance of age relations. Right. So Okay, so this is where the historian does a lot of context, right? So why the youth turn in Singapore? Why was there a youth turn in Singapore during and after the Second World War? So even though I argue that the youth turn in Singapore occurred in the 40s and 70s, I need to acknowledge that the management of youth was actually a domain that reflected longer continuities across Singapore history in the 20th century. Singapore's history as a cosmopolitan hub city meant that it was on the receiving end of circulations of new ideas and new youth movements arising in different places around the world. So of course, British imperialism was a major influence where changing Western ideas about adolescence, about childhood and youth, and increasing colonial anxieties about the conduct and bodies of young boys and girls in the colonies saw the entry and establishment of British youth movements like the Boy Scouts, the Girl Guides, the Boys Brigades, for example, or the entry of European and Western educated social reformers, educators, and missionaries who introduced institutions and programs to discipline and police the bodies of boys and girls. Right? Scholars like David Pomfret, Rachel Liao, and Christina Wu have written a lot about this. And in addition to due to the heavy influx of Chinese migrants into the port city, the Chinese became the overwhelming majority in Singapore, and this meant that Singapore was also a node of intellectual currents concerning childhood and youth, emanating from intellectuals, reformers, and educators in China. So scholars like David Kelly and Karen Teo have contributed important works on the impact of these intellectual currents on student political activism in the Chinese schools and on girls' education in colonial Singapore. And I think that there is further room for further research in this area. And this is especially when the Chinese community in Singapore remains connected to the Sinophone world and its images and ideas of ideal children and youth, at least until the 1970s, as Prof. Shi Lanjin's and the students' work have already shown. Right, the Japanese occupation of Singapore between 1942 and 1945 saw the entry of another source, another layer of ideas and beliefs about the importance of disciplining, mobilizing, and policing youth. Right, so Japanese ideas about disciplining youth, of which there is a growing historiography, which includes the recent work by Dr. Sayaka Chatani of the NUS History Department, influenced Japanese social and cultural policies in Singapore. So for the 3 years of the occupation, Japanese administrators, military officers, artists, and intellectuals also tried to mold local children and youth into new imperial subjects in the shape of Japanese children and Japanese youth. And I'm glad that Dr. Masakazu Matsuoka is able to join the talk today because he has written a few articles in Japanese about analyzing the use of music and children's magazines to study some of these programs and efforts. Right, so I'm trying to say that this existing trans-imperial connections partly explain why youth was such a powerful and conducive entry point to justify the extension of state power over the bodies and minds of children and youth in Singapore. It was already a category with great social and cultural resonance and relevance among the dominant social groups and communities then. But even with these existing connections, I'm arguing that there is a discernible youth turn after the 1940s. And my basis for arguing so is that there was a clear transformation in the intensity and the nature of the attention paid to the conduct, the activity, and welfare of children and youth from that point onwards. After 1942, the different governments that governed Singapore began to discipline and mobilize Singapore's youth on a citywide scale, trying to turn them into productive and cohesive subject citizens of a new self-governing city, country, and colony. Right, and the most important explanation for this youth turn during this period is a straightforward one: demographics. At this point in time, youthfulness was Singapore's social reality, right? Something we tend to not remember about the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. According to statistics compiled by Professor Soshi Hawk, in 1947, 62.2% of the resident population of Singapore was under the age of 30, with 36% under the age of 15. And this explains why, during this period, colonial officers, local politicians, and their allies constantly invoke the refrain that more than 60% of Singapore was under the age of 21. So economic policies, social policies were all meant and targeted for a very youthful population. And this demographic reality combusted with local, regional, and global developments to make youth an increasingly visible and significant social category, as well as an increasingly vital state and adult concern. Right. At the same time, Singapore's transition from a British colony to a Japanese imperial city, to a decolonizing country in the making, to an independent sovereign state over these 3 decades, turned on a question of how to integrate this mostly youthful population from different ethnic, cultural, and linguistic backgrounds into one single political community. right? And the four governments that governed Singapore through these 30 years realized that youth as an age-based category and idea was a convenient and conducive entry point to try to transcend or displace the existing differences that divided the communities of Singapore then. For instance, by relying on the idea that young people, no matter regardless of race or religion or class, shared the same needs, aspirations, and interests. And there will be this concerted effort to try to create policies and programs based on this myth that no matter what your race or culture is, based on your age, you have certain needs and aspirations. So they are trying to use this to displace the differences of race and class, for instance, right? So furthermore, within the context of the British government's post-war plans to eventually grant Singapore self-government and independence, colonial administrators and local patriots and nationalists recognized that any nation-building project required the support of this youthful population and their parents. Right, the welfare of children and youth became key markers of legitimacy, and this was of course compounded and influenced partly by changing developments in the colonial metropole across the mid-20th century, where the Labour government that governed the UK took on more responsibilities for colonial welfare and youth welfare. And this is where Singapore historian Dr. Toh Chi Tim has already accounted for this in his work on the emergence of the social welfare state in Singapore across the same time period. So these changing attitudes towards the welfare of children and youth also converge with global humanitarian attention on children and youth who were displaced by the devastating Second World War. Right. So hence, when the British returned to Singapore after the end of the war, there was a lot of attention on the welfare and the needs of children and youth, as Dr. Ho Chi Tim has showed in his work. And the Second World War led to the malnourishment of children, the rise of youth crime, youth unemployment, juvenile delinquency, and gangsterism among this youthful population. And all this had to be addressed in order for the Singapore economy and society to be restored to its basically pre-war stability. And of course, I mean, this talk is mentioned the Cold War origins, and so we can't forget the Cold War angle here. So there was this vital political dimension to why the British colonial government and their allies were very keen to provide youth welfare after their return, which is their security interests in the region. When they returned to Singapore in August 1945, they were greeted by a variety of anti-colonial movements, left-wing movements, and a communist movement in the form of the Malayan Communist Party. So for some of the reasons mentioned earlier, these movements were driven and dominated by young people, and the active involvement of young students and younger adults in clamoring for social and political change in Singapore, as well as in other parts of Asia during this period, could only have increased the consciousness of youth as a potent symbol of the future, basically a powerful political force that had to be both policed and tamed, and at the same time mobilized for the state's own agenda. So we also tend to forget that at this point in time, the People's Action Party that has ruled Singapore since 1959 was, when it was formed, was a party or form of the most active youth activists in Singapore at that point in time. And hence it won't be surprising that from day one, they all understood the importance of mobilizing and policing youth idealism at the same time. Right? But we are focusing on the British colonial officers and their local allies. So this group of people place a new emphasis on young people to prevent the increasingly active and influential MCP from exploiting the social, economic, and political grievances of this mostly youthful population. And as the story of the World Assembly of Youth that I mentioned at the beginning suggests, British attempts to compete for the hearts and minds of young people in Singapore converge with this global competition between the Western democracies and the Soviet Union for the loyalties of young people. So in Singapore, part of the colonial administration strategies to create new Malayan youth or Singapore youth who were pro-British or just anti-communist was the mobilization of existing community and youth organizations and youth movements to compete with their political and ideological enemies for the loyalties of local youth. Right, and so the image of ideal youth they envisioned was frequently defined against the communist other or the delinquent other. And I think this is where the story of the Singapore Youth Council comes into the story. Right. So in January 1948, on the behest of the colonial government's welfare officers, European expatriates, local Eurasians, and English-educated Chinese, Malay, Indian middle-class professionals came together to form an organization called the Singapore Youth Council to coordinate and promote the interests of all youth organizations in Singapore. And these people tend to be the leaders of the pro-British, or simply not pro-British, but non-left-wing youth organizations in the colony. And the existence of this sizable group of English-educated middle-class adults and youth movements who already embrace Western ideas about youth explains why youth welfare work and youth service work expanded quickly in Singapore after the war. So this is just this slide. Let's show the different organizations that made up and constituted this Singapore Youth Council, right? Some of which still exist today. So beginning from a pioneering group of 13 organizations in 1948, they grew to about 36 organizations in 1959, its last year of existence. So for a decade between 1948 and 1959, until the PAP government dissolved it in 1959, it was at the Singapore Youth Council was at the forefront of the colonial government's efforts to discipline, mobilize, and police the young in Singapore. So its reported membership of 40,000 youth was small compared to the amount of youth in the colony. Hence, this hints that the SYC wasn't that effective or wasn't that successful. But nonetheless, its formation highlight the emergence of an assemblage of youth organizations, youth workers, and youth leaders that became part of the disciplinary state's apparatus for managing youth. So the SYC's fundamental purpose was to channel youth into youth organizations and activities that its sponsors and its leaders thought was legitimate and constructive. For example, such as youth camping. This is when the active promotion of youth camps as a disciplinary activity and a pedagogical activity for children and youth became a part of state policy. As the colonial government began to support and encourage youth organizations to engage in camping as a way to simultaneously socialize and police youth, especially working class youth. And many of us who have done camping in schools are in a way have encountered the legacies of this attempt to popularize camping as an activity for young people. So the SYC also mobilized their members to participate in state-organized public ceremonies and rituals that demonstrate youth support for the colonial government. For example, they organized education weeks, youth weeks, to publicize the government's programs for young people in Singapore. And these public spectacles of youth ultimately represented efforts to deploy youthful bodies for disciplinary purposes. They were meant to reproduce images of ideal youth who were incorporated into the colonial state instead of being outside of the state or in opposition to the state. And these efforts also sought to persuade Singapore's youth and their parents that the government and their allies now considered the welfare and education of young people of all communities its priority. This was a clear departure from pre-World War II state of affairs, and this symbolized a new political rationality where the Singapore government placed the aspirations of young people center stage and used the best interests of the young as justification for scrutinizing and intervening in their lives and in their conduct. Right. So the SYC was also plugged into different trans-imperial and international youth movements that served different imperial, Cold War, and global humanitarian agendas, such as the World Assembly of Youth. And this, in a sense, this is where youth workers and youth leaders in Singapore gain access to many ideas and resources with which to further youth development work in Singapore. For instance, the very first United Nations Youth Welfare Seminar in India in 1951 led to key developments in youth work in Singapore. As a result of the recommendations of the SYC delegate to this UN seminar, the colonial government created a youth services section in the social welfare department to support the growth of youth organizations. They also began to support the cultivation and training of youth leaders to support the efforts to discipline, mobilize, and police young people in Singapore. So given that youth leaders and youth leadership have become seemingly natural categories in public discourse in Singapore today, I think it is useful and important to destabilize this category and show how this category that we take for granted today were actually deeply implicated in the cultural politics of youth in Singapore since the 1950s. The training of youth leaders was part of British plans to produce good anti-communist citizens with good character and civic consciousness. And these youth leaders became the counterfoil to other categories of youth, such as the delinquent, the protester, the radical, or the gangster. Right. So in a sense, there was all this basically all these things going on as a colonial state and their allies tried to mobilize young people to in a sense support its activities and programs. And between 1948 and 1955, the SYC grew in prominence, its seeming growth and dominance on the youth scene was actually enabled by the British government's tight grip on public space through the prohibition of left-wing or anti-colonial activity. But when the colonial authorities liberalized this political climate, in order to prepare the colony for gradual political development, powerful youth and student movements erupted. And the rise of these youth movements exposed the SYC's failure to acquire the support of the majority of Singapore's youthful population. Right, within the entangled politics of youth, anti-colonialism, race, language, culture, and education in 1950s Singapore, the SYC's close ties with the colonial government actually became a poison chalice. On the one hand, they got a lot of support and resources. On the other hand, it alienated the SYC from most of Singapore's anti-colonial, working class, or non-English educated youth. This is just another picture for another event that was held by the SYC in 1956 as they desperately tried to regain their relevance and popularity, but ultimately they failed. But nonetheless, even though the SYC failed to achieve its ambitious objectives, I argue that it established important precedents and principles and practices for the adult-led, state-sponsored mobilization and schooling of youth in Singapore. So one lasting impact was the institutional definition of a genuine youth organization. At the SYC's first general meeting in April 1948, their member organizations agreed that they only recognize youth organizations as organizations that were organized on a non-political basis. They only conducted activities that promoted the moral, physical, recreational, developmental, and social interests and needs of young people. They deliberately excluded political and ideological activities. So these definitions confine the work of legitimate youth organizations, legitimate and genuine youth organizations, to the domains of youth development, youth welfare, and youth recreation. And this was now constructed as non-political and non-ideological domains. And the Singapore state continued to use this normative definition to regulate this domain of social life in Singapore, demarcating youth work and youth welfare as a non-political and non-ideological domain. And youth organizations don't receive state recognition if they are seen as political or ideological. And this was even though this position that youth organizations were to be non-political was itself obviously very political. This was meant to give the colonial government the ability to identify and support youth organizations that they deem desirable and to police and exclude others that they think would be a threat to their agendas. Right. So this points to my observation that the mobilization of youth workers, youth leaders, and youth movements to cooperate in the disciplining and mobilization and policing of youth in Singapore remains a key technique of the Singapore disciplinary state. And what we can also see through the story of the SYC is how youth activity and youth culture became a domain of social policy and a site of adult and state scrutiny and attention on young people's conduct in order to preserve their respective agendas. So my next example of the Singapore Youth Sports Centre will further demonstrate these themes. I think many of us who are Singaporeans may not remember the existence of this institution, the Singapore Youth Sports Centre. You might recognize this building, which is the old Kallang Airport Terminal, and it may strike you as strange that that there is a file labeled secret on something that seems as innocuous as a youth sports centre. And this itself suggests that it was not a very benign or very altruistic thing in itself. Okay, so the dramatic ascendancy of youth protest movements just before and following the 1955 Singapore elections that I mentioned earlier only heightened the anxieties of British officials and local anti-communist politicians and nationalists regarding the activities of working class youth, especially male Chinese working class youth. So this formed the backdrop for the David Marshall and Lim Yew Hock-led Labour Front governments that formed the government of Singapore between 1955 and 1959 to support a new colony-wide program to provide sporting recreation for young people. So the development of sporting activity between 1942 and 1959 and the establishment of this Singapore Youth Sports Centre have since disappeared from the pages of Singapore history. And this is even though I argue that this SYSC was critical for the development and transformation of sports and community recreation into a ubiquitous technology of power for the expanding Singapore disciplinary state. And the SYSC was in fact housed in the old Kallang Airport Terminal that was for a very long time the HQ of the People's Association. So for my friends in Vancouver, the People's Association is a massive state-directed central coordinating agency for community centers, community programs, and community organizations in Singapore. And I actually want to argue that the SYSC was in fact one of the ancestors of the People's Association. Right? This is even though the People's Association of official histories have actually become silent about its origins in the converging politics of youth, the Cold War, decolonization, and nation building in the 1950s. The story of the SYSC actually illuminates how colonial officers and local non-state actors saw the provision of more sporting recreation for young people as the solution to the problems of delinquent, restless, and rebellious youth. And they saw it as a solution to the challenge of incorporating them into the Singapore state. And this has of course led to the impact of where many of us in Singapore today take the idea of sports for young people and sports for everyone for granted today. And the origins of this belief and this norm is actually dates back to this period when they saw that they saw sports as a solution to dealing with the problem of youth. And the SYSC was actually the brainchild of Malcolm MacDonald, who was the Commissioner General of the UK for Southeast Asia in 1948 and 1955. As the paramount colonial officer in Malaya and Singapore, he oversaw Singapore's and Malaya's rehabilitation from the war. He was also deeply involved in the efforts to forge a viable non-communist multicultural Singapore. So on 17 August 1955, just before he left to begin a new appointment as the High Commissioner of India, he donated $5,000 to start a fund for the establishment of this youth center, where, in his words, young people of every race and every creed could meet for sports and friendship together. And he wanted this center to train Singapore's children to be healthy in mind and fit in body, to fulfill their roles as future citizens. And healthy minds and fit bodies was the English public school ideal that British officers like MacDonald had internalized through their education in British public schools, and it emphasized participation in sports to develop Christian morality, physical fitness, and manly character. Those of you who are from ACS will know what this means, right? So on 12 October 1956, an audience of about 7,000 witnessed the center's grand opening ceremony. And after that, it brought into operation offerings, facilities, and coaching sessions for a variety of sports. And this center was actually supported by many people in Singapore. There was a whole fundraising campaign, and about 300,000 was raised to build this center, and the Labour Front government donated the old Kallang Airport Terminal building to be the HQ for this center. And one of the key drivers of this center was actually a businessman and cinema magnate, the guy who built the Cathay building in Singapore, Lok Wan Tho. Right. So I like this photo because this photo shows how colonial officers, civil corporate interests, commercial interests, and basically private individuals came in to combine to get their forces together to decide that they want to exert biopower over the bodies and minds of young people. And for those of us with an NUS connection, the superintendent of the SYSC, Hugh Savage, is actually the father of Professor Victor Savage. Right. Yeah. But end of the day, ultimately, the story of the SYSC basically shows that that different groups of Singapore society, whether is it corporate interests as well as the general public, agreed that they need to support youth welfare and youth needs. And it also shows that they recognize that it was in their interest to help the government discipline and police youth conduct and activity so as to counter the threat of radical and delinquent youth. There was a clear emphasis on making membership of this sports center available and free for underprivileged youth. So it was meant to basically divert as many working class youth into sports as much as possible. So this attests to the SYSC's fundamental purpose to address the anxieties of colonial officials, as well as invested businessmen and elites about preventing an underprivileged and working class youth from posing further threats to their interests.
Sorry, Edgar, can you wrap up because we're running short on time? We only have an hour. Thanks.
Sure, I can do that. I can wrap up. So I will just try to wrap up quickly. So basically, this is just a photo of the opening ceremony, showing you the amount of public support for this and what a momentous occasion it was. Something interesting I found during the research was that American funding and expertise provided through this organization called the Asia Foundation was vital to the SYSC's development. And this basically suggests that youth sports and recreation became part of the Cultural Cold War in Southeast Asia in the 1950s. And this is the area that I think war research, right? So even though the PAP, after it came to power in 1959, basically closed down these two organizations, the SYC and the SYSC, this is why we don't hear about it anymore. Its functions and its programs and its purposes were all transferred to new institutions, such as the People's Association, such as the Singapore Council of Social Service, and an organization called the National Youth Leadership Training Institute. So even though these two organizations have very short-lived lives, the purposes and the political rationality of youth that underpin these two institutions continued into the PAP government, right? And of course, my other chapters look at that. So let me conclude by suggesting some of the reflections and observations I have about how these stories actually can change our understanding of Singapore history. I mean, so the first so what that I've already briefly discussed is that the bringing age relations in Singapore history actually shows that it actually goes beyond the national frame. I already discussed how basically that examining this history of youth, we cannot simply look at what's going on in Singapore, but we need to connect what's going on in Singapore with wider developments as well as trends in imperial and transnational circulations. So I won't repeat this. I would like to, in a sense, use this history of youth to basically complicate and challenge how we see Singapore. There is this popular prevalent paradigm of using the developmental state arguments, the idea that Singapore is a state that is mainly focused on economic development to characterize Singapore. But I would like to bring in this other dimension, the Singapore disciplinary state, to show that there is a different phase of Singapore where it is not so much, it is focused on economics, but it's also very much focused on trying to engineer and shape young people's conduct and activity. But I don't want to argue that this invalidates that developmental state paradigm. I'm trying to avoid a binary framework by saying that actually the Singapore state has both its developmental and its disciplinary dimensions, and they're actually synergistic. As I try to suggest, many of the policies meant for youth were done to basically reincorporate young people back into the economy, back into relationships with the Singapore state economy. So I would argue that these two different approaches are actually synergistic.
All right, thank you very much, Edgar.
Yeah.
So I noticed that today we have 80 participants. That's very outstanding for a Saturday morning. Although, I mean, I guess some of this is because we're also all stuck at home in Singapore. But I'm really grateful that so many of you have decided to spend your time with us today. Without much further ado, let me switch over to Sri Lanjun, who will give us some comments before we turn to Q&A. Lanjun, please. Lanjun? Lanjun, you're muted. You have to unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me now? Yeah. Yes?
Yep, please go ahead.
Can you? Okay, good. So, okay, first I'd like to thank you Yin's invitation to be the discussant of this talk, because I only have 5 minutes, so I will just keep it short. So first I'd like to congratulations to Edgar on completing this exciting dissertation. And I like your paper very much because it fits my current research needs very much. I'm doing something like about the popular culture in the 1950s, Singapore and Malay, and I feel youth is such an important term. Actually, I cannot avoid, but I cannot find a very good book actually on systematic study of the history of youth in Singapore. So Edgar's paper, or actually his dissertation, actually looks into the Singapore history through a very unique perspective of the age relations and traces actually the evolution of ideas of youth and also their uses in modern Singapore by different political agents. And he very convincingly actually argues that there was a youth turn in Singapore history during the transitional period between the 1940s and the 1970s. I understand actually that Edgar's first book is about the left-wing student activism in Singapore. So as an evolution from that book or progress from that book, this dissertation actually put the history of Singapore youth in a large context and aims to give us a more, a more complete history of youth mobilization in post-1942 Singapore, which more emphasizes that youth activism and youth pursuit of idealism remain embedded in power relations, end quote. So in other words, actually the youth empowerment can become actually a very useful technique of the disciplinary state to preserve the state and also adopt interests and structures and hierarchies, rather than just as actually his first book already started a challenge or critique. So until now, there are still very few actually, or not so much attention on age relations and youth as topics of historical analysis in Southeast Asia studies. So Edgar's research is original and also important and fills in that gap. So generally speaking, actually youth stands for newness, future, and also change. But it's also always like could become a problem because youth is a very confused being and it could go to different directions, which depends on certain guidance and control. So to a certain degree, the bodies and the minds of a child and the youth becomes a site of contestation and a convergence of global developments linked to like, as Edgar mentioned, the British and the Japanese imperialism, decolonization, and the Cold War in Asia. So in particular, I think Edgar's research tells us during the 1940s and 1960s, there emerged actually a number of disciplinary institutions, programs, and agents that sought to shape, regularize, homogenize, and regulate young people's subjectivities and their behaviors. And the stories of the SYC and also the SYSC he presented actually are part of the historical process. And I especially appreciate Edgar's efforts to demonstrate a continuity in the ways of managing youth through the different time periods in modern Singapore. And he argues actually that the governmentality of youth actually was not a PAP government invention. Rather, it has a much longer history. And another important merit of this project is its transnational dimension. And Edgar actually treats the Singapore youth as one part of international youth movement. And actually he looks into the intersecting politics of youth decolonization and the Cold War that I think in his presentation already points out actually the SYC transnational connection and of the flows of the funding from the Asian Foundation and also the flow of new ideas of the youth. So here, actually, I'd like to pose some questions. Actually, maybe we can discuss together. So the first question is related to the concept of the youth, or the sometimes maybe more precise is the concept of Malay youth. I understand actually in this paper, you very much focus on actually the not left-wing side, actually, but actually I know you have a complete picture there. So I'm very much interested though. So actually the definition of youth is multiple and plural in this period by different agents. So I'm very much to like to hear how you like position actually your study of your first book and your study in this book. In other words, actually I also like to see how because from your presentation and also the paper, I can see for these institutions, the colonial government's institution is very full those like middle class family, children, youth, and also English from the English medium schools. And I know there is other parts of left wing side Chinese medium school, those youth. So I just wonder, since youth is kind of a side of contestation, do they have a place of these ideas? There is a kind of meeting together. There is a chance, and they have the kind of exchanging or meeting. So this is confronting each other, or more precisely, there is any like debates. There is possibility for these different kinds of the youth ideas. That's they put together and debate. So during that time periods. So this is my one question. Actually, the other is about your current analysis is very much at least for this paper, or actually because I haven't read your whole dissertation, it's very much from the policy level. So so I'm very if in terms of the relations, it's like age relations, it means adult and the youth. So now I see more like this is kind of adult or state authorities' ideas or imaginings of idea use. But I'm really curious. So what is the voice of the youth of that time, or this institute, the youth actually, the institute trying to target? What are their views or experiences of these institutions? So in terms of research materials, so I'm very interested whether you did any oral interview, or like with the people of that time, maybe have experience with these institutions. So this is, I'd like to hear their voice. This is the second question. Actually, also there is one more question is about the gender perspective. You mentioned actually some places, especially about the second one. The institution you means actually those male actually from the low work class family, those youths are most dangerous. So actually the second, the sports institution trying to include or integrate that group. So I just wonder, so how about like these institutions you see not so effective? So I'm very interested when they in their policy or their internal reports, whether you have any like discussions of, or they actually understand the youth in a more concrete group, like boy, girl, and from which class actually they have different policies for in order to increase that group. So this is my third question. So about the gender perspective, and maybe one, I think I stop here. Maybe I think so can receive question from the audience. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Lan. That's really great. I mean, I'm struck by a contrast from Edgar's presentation, right? The newspaper is from May 1954. Of course, we know that in May 1954, we also have the anti-national service riots, actually protests, not riots, surrounding Fort Canning, which is just right by the Padang, which you showed in your picture. So that sort of contrast is an interesting one. We've already got several questions. I'm going to ask some of you to unmute to get more participation, as much participation as we can. So Qianwen, perhaps since you had the first question come up, could you unmute and quickly ask? We'll collect some of them, and then Edgar, you can answer them together.
Sure. Thanks for that great talk, Edgar. My question actually relates to what Lan Jun was saying in her comments, and that has to do with the question of agency and how is it that we assess or an attempt to engage with youth responses to top-down efforts and community efforts and mobilization. I'm particularly interested in the term in your mention of the ineffectiveness of the SYC, because this obviously also relates to the question of agency and how is it that the SYC measured effectiveness.
All right. Thank you very much, Qianwen. Philip?
Okay, sure. Is that working? Can you see me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. So I just wanted to ask Edgar about the issue of today and whether youth in Singapore continue to be an object of disciplinary attention, and if that has a connection to the past.
Thank you. And we'll take one more question. Joshua Sim.
Sorry, there's a background noise because my son is watching a video. Yeah, my question is similar to Lan Jun. It's about the Lan Jun's question about the voice of the youth. And essentially, I'm asking, to what extent did the youth internalize and contribute to the state's disciplinary agenda, and did the youth groups and the young people themselves, in a sense, influence or shape these policies and the institutions like SYSC? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joshua. I mean, it's the so youth are differentiated, right? Because apart from the ethnic Chinese youth at this point, we also see mobilization in Malaya, the Kesatuan Melayu Muda, which is starting to get active, pretty active during this time. So, anyways, we'll take these three questions first. Edgar, would you like to answer briefly, please? Thank you.
Well, I'm sorry for taking so much time with my presentation because some of these questions we will need enough 40 minutes to address. I do talk about some of these questions in the dissertation. So let me tackle which one first. So for Chen Wen's question about agency, how do I assess the agency of the SYC? So the SYC itself, they did a lot. If you look at it, when I look at the documents, they themselves were in a state of shock when the 1955 elections happened, and it turned out that the Labour Front and the PAP won the elections. And because so it was interesting because like in the 1955 elections, we know that the left-wing groups basically protested and rallied against the colonial government. What we don't know is that the SYC actually mobilized its members to participate in the elections as a kind of political enfranchisement. The SYC members were encouraged to get their young people to participate in elections or to register as voters. So these two different groups of youth were actually involved in the same 1955 elections at the same point in time. So they themselves were shocked at how the left-wing groups became ascendant after 1955. And in the documents, they actually were doing a lot of reflecting about why they were not having success in terms of reaching out to what they call the vernacular youth groups. The groups basically are the youth who were not in the English schools, or the youth that were not associated with the Christian or with the pro-colonial youth organizations. So there was a great effort to try to include more Chinese youth groups. There was an effort to include more Malay youth groups. But they themselves, they didn't really succeed. And by the time the PAP came in power, it was too late. So in a sense, they themselves measured their effectiveness using the KPI of how many youth they represented and how many youth organizations they could convince to be part of the Singapore Youth Council. So that is how they measure it. And for the question of gender, I think Professor Skelton in the chat also asked a question about gender. So what I try to uncover, I try to excavate this a bit more in the dissertation, where I point out that even though these colonial officers, this middle class or elite businessmen were trying to promote a genderless, classless, raceless idea of youth using the idea of age, this was in fact a very class and gendered and a very racialized category, because it was mainly male working class youth that they were targeting using this supposedly classless and deracialized or genderless category. But in fact, if we look at the Japanese and the British colonial efforts, the flow of power was very masculine. It was mainly males deciding what to do for everyone. They tried to include everybody in their programs regardless of gender, but it was based on their masculine middle class ideas of what was ideal youth culture and what were ideal youth activities for young people. And there was, I mean, in one of my chapters, I deal with Japanese ideas and images of young people in Singapore, and that's where I show using this colonial newspaper called the Shonan Shimbun. Basically what the Straits Times was called during then. I basically try to show how, in a sense, while the Japanese tried to mobilize both male and females, they did so in a way where females were subordinate to males. For instance, like males were valorized, their bodies were valorized as soldiers, as combatants, and as labor, And then basically women were mobilized to take over the jobs that the men had to leave behind because they had to go and fight in the war. So this was done. There was a kind of paternity going on, and then this changes throughout the different governments. So the ideas changes as well. So young women was mainly invisible because it was in the eyes of these colonial officers, and in the eyes of this basically mainly male working class individuals. It was male youth that had to be tamed and male youth that had to be taken into control. And then basically girls was an afterthought. And then later on when it came to the PAP, it's a different story altogether. And I think Dr. Shi's question about the images of youth is important because I think what I try to do more in the dissertation is to show how the ideas and images of youth that these different groups envision was often done in juxtaposition to the other types of youth that was going on. And this comes out more strongly in the chapters on the PAP, where basically I try to argue and show that the image of ideal youth that the Singapore PAP government kept after 1965 was based on merging and merging. It makes it sound mechanistic, but the idea is that they wanted the best qualities of the two main groups of youth in Singapore then, the Chinese educated and the English educated. They wanted the English educated youth, the people like Willie in the audience, some of these. So there was a question about interviewing some of these people. I could have interviewed some of the people in the audience who were basically elite English educated youth in the 60s and 70s, right? They wanted so I in the dissertation, in the chapter, I basically look at how Lee Kuan Yew, for instance, and Goh Keng Swee thought of young people, and how it is based on trying to get the best qualities that they thought were good from the English educated, and the best qualities that they got and they took was good from the Chinese educated. So the ideal modern Singaporean.
The other questions too.
Yeah, sorry.
Because we're going to some of the other questions too.
Yeah, sure.
Right. So Willie Wong and Jack Chia, perhaps you two can go, and then I'll get Anthony Leong in. If you guys will indulge me, I'll go on for a little bit longer so I can get more questions in. Please go ahead. Willie Wong. Yep. Thanks.
Yeah, Edgar, I typed my question.
Yeah, yes, Willie.
I'm just wondering whether, from your research into the historical perspective of youth movement in Singapore, whether you have any insights into how this historical perspective has kind of influenced the youth in Singapore today. Maybe I generalize it too much, but I personally feel that the youth in Singapore today is very apolitical. In other words, we have skewed so much into the economic development of Singapore that all our resources kind of geared towards that I find youth today, like I say, maybe I generalize too much.
Okay.
Not very political in their views.
All right. Thank you.
I don't know whether you agree with me.
Thanks, Willie. Perhaps we can turn to Jack.
Hi, Edgar. Thanks for your fascinating talk. So in your slide on the Singapore Youth Council, I noticed that that several of the religious youth organizations that you listed were mostly Christian groups. So I just wonder if you could tell us more about how the religious organizations engage with and mobilize youth, in the time period you study. And also, I noticed that some of the major religions in Singapore, like for instance, like for Buddhism, Hinduism, and Taoism, were not represented in the SYC. So was it because they did not have a youth group at that time? So I would wonder if you could just comment on that. Thank you.
All right, thanks. And then we'll have Anthony quickly ask your question. I'm trying to get as much people in as possible. Anthony Leong. If not, then perhaps Tracy Skelton.
Sorry, I think we dealt with my question earlier.
All right.
Yeah, thanks. yeah, that was discussed quite a bit. Thank you very much.
Okay, so Edgar, why don't you go ahead, please?
Yeah, so to Jack's question, unfortunately, I have to throw the question back at you because you're the leading expert on Buddhism in Singapore. And I did not come across any reference to Buddhist Taoist groups in the documents I looked at. And mainly because I look at colonial archives and colonial documents. And what is clear is that this world, the English educated world, had no idea what was going on in the non-English educated world. So they were desperately trying, they did surveys, they were trying to find out what kind of youth organizations existed in Singapore. They didn't get a lot of responses and didn't succeed. So I unfortunately I cannot answer that question until I look at other kind of documents and other sources. And of course, if you find other documents and sources in your extensive networks in your research, please let me know as well. But in this case, yeah, I didn't see any references to any Taoist or Buddhist youth, and I certainly didn't have come across anything that suggested that they were included as in the group they consider as left wing or leftist. Yeah, but I think that's a fascinating question. I hope that I will, in my future research, I can find some answers for you, or you can find some answers for me. And for these questions, I think.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, I can discuss this with Willie next time when he comes back.
I think. Okay. So I guess we'll have. I'll just read out the last few questions because we don't have that many left. If you can hear me. So one, we have Sochong Cat asking. By co-opting the youth of Singapore and disciplining them, isn't this a way for various governments to defang them and prevent them from dangerous activities such as political activism? School uniforms, extracurricular activities, etc., could be seen in this light, couldn't it? Jonathan Tahusi Jarana asks, thanks you for your presentation, but also of militarized youth and students in Indonesia during the Japanese occupation and post-war revolutionary period. The Indonesian experience of the occupation was much more positive than Singapore's, and so their influence on youth culture in Indonesia is still strongly felt. Could you comment on how far the youth movement in Singapore inherited Japanese values post-war and how they the values of their previous colonizers, the British, the SYC? And Jason Salim asks, if how the PAP government in the first decade mobilized youth after having dissolved the SYC. There seems to be a large gap between the dissolution of the SYC in 1959 and the formation of the NYC in 1989. He notes that the PAYM was founded in 1971. Was youth mobilized mainly through the MOE or through Singapore Sports Council? Lo Nguyen Kiang asks if there were attempts within the SYC to groom future leaders that could possibly assume political roles and further interests of the developmental and disciplinary states. And finally, Masakazu Matsuoka asks asks a question about historiography in Singapore. In Japan, particularly among scholars of educational history, they're relatively reluctant to discuss the impact of Japanese education during the occupation, partly because there's some sense of guilt. So the question is, if such emotional conflict to argue the impact of Japanese education among historians exists in Singapore. Okay, and that's all our questions.
Oh, wow. Okay, so I will deal with the Dr. Matsuoka's questions first. I'm surprised to hear that there is or maybe I'm not surprised to hear that there's some kind of tension within the Japanese scholars about discussing the impact of education. I think for the Singapore historians, I think we discuss the Japanese occupation quite freely. If there's any tensions, it is from the public, the general public, who may not be very happy about how historians talk about the jail and talk about the jail. So that even historians, I don't think there's a lot of tensions, but usually—
We don't talk about collaboration though. We don't talk about collaboration. We're uncomfortable with collaboration.
I'm comfortable with collaboration for different reasons and not emotional guilt, unfortunately. Yeah, so that's that. So were there attempts within SYC to groom future leaders? Definitely. I think I mentioned in the talk how youth leaders as a category was, youth leaders, the training of youth leaders was a technique and the program meant to create more agents, right? Agents of the state, agents of the disciplinary state. And to do that. And even today, there is a lot of attention on developing youth leaders of Singapore who will continue to be incorporated. I don't want to use the word co-opted right into the state. So there's that. So for Jason's question, actually the first PAYM was 1966. The PAYM 1971 was the second version. The version that was done in the 1960s failed because it was actually an Israeli youth advisor who came to advise the People's Association on how to set up a PAYM, and it was based on the Israeli youth movement, and which was very uniform and very regimented, and hence it didn't sit well with the community leaders, and so it failed. So the 1971 PAYM was a second generation PAYM. So there was an earlier one. Even before the PAYM, there were other organizations like the Vigilante Corps. So there was a Vigilante Corps and the work brigades, which was similarly attempts by the government to mobilize the population, mostly youthful population, to participate in nation building. So it wasn't through MOE or the Sports Council, but many different organizations and many different institutions. Yeah. So I think one of the arguments that I try to make in the dissertation is that the government has always believed in the importance of youth mobilization, and always believe in the importance of encouraging youth social activism and youth idealism. So this goes back to the earlier question about defanging. I would say that saying that the government of Singapore wanted to defang young people is reductive and doesn't see the whole picture, where on the one hand they defang certain groups of youth and certain kinds of youth activism, but they actually have always encouraged and sponsored, in fact, other kinds of pursuits of youth idealism. And somewhere else in my dissertation, I argue that actually there was a shift in the mid-1950s where people like Goh Keng Swee openly and vocally says that we actually need to mobilize young people's idealism and their desire for agency and create change for nation building. And this is where organizations like the National Youth Leadership Training Institute was created by Goh Keng Swee in 1966. Today it's called the National Community Leaders Institute. It is still at Buona Vista in Singapore, but this is the origin. So at National Service, if you look at the documents, was made firstly not for defense. If you read Goh Keng Swee's speech in Parliament when he read the policy where he defended the policy, it was meant to discipline young people, and he didn't talk a lot about the defense objectives and motives. It was first meant to basically change young people from their deficient, decadent previous self into a more disciplined, citizenry. So the aim of NS was actually first to mobilize and to discipline the bodies and subjectivity of Singaporeans. Right. And for Jonathan's questions, I'm not that familiar with the Indonesian case, but there is actually a lot of literature on the Indonesian example. You probably need to read scholars like Yuji Akashi, who's the one who has written the most about it. And there, if you get in touch with me, I can share with you what I know about the literature on the period, and then you might have to look at it. For Singapore's case, a lot of the oral history accounts and a lot of the studies so far have shared testimonies of how the people who were mobilized by the Japanese said that they learned things like the main word what they learned was discipline, the value of discipline, the whole attribute of discipline. So there were some interviews and some accounts who actually said that they were happy that they received training in this Japanese kind of discipline. So maybe that will be the value that has contributed the most in Singapore society. I guess in Singapore and Malayan society.
All right. Thank you. Well, you actually got through all of them. So we are obviously a bit over. So I'd like to really thank everybody for your indulgence. I think we had a real treat today to talk about youth and youth mobilization, which is something that's so deeply ingrained in Singapore politics and society. And I'd like to ask everyone to look out for our next seminar. And really thank you for spending your Saturday morning with us. I look forward to seeing everybody real soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. For those of you back home, hope to be able to go back home and see everyone soon face to face.